That quiet hum you hear is not the sound of jet engines warming up for another record-breaking day. It is the sound of a dream beginning to unravel. Dubai, a city that once made the impossible its daily routine, a city that planted skyscrapers in the sand and called it civilization, a city that convinced the world that ambition alone could defy gravity. That city is now facing something it never prepared for. Silence. And not the peaceful kind. March 2026 did not arrive with a warning. It did not send a polite notice to the 5-star concierge desks or the penthouse boardrooms or the glittering duty-free temples of Terminal 3. It arrived suddenly, violently, and without mercy. And in the space of just a few weeks, a narrative that had been decades in the making began to crack right down the middle. This is not a story about one bad quarter. This is not a travel advisory that will be quietly revised in 6 months. What is happening in Dubai right now is something far more fundamental. It is the collision between a city built entirely on the belief that growth never ends and a reality that has finally, brutally, decided to disagree. So let us go back to where it all began to fall apart. Because if you want to understand what is killing Dubai's tourism dream, you have to start where every dream in this city starts and ends. The airport. There is a reason Dubai International Airport was the busiest in the world. Not because of geography alone, though the geography helped. It was because Dubai had constructed an entire identity around the idea of the hub. Connect east to west. Connect money to ambition. Connect every corner of the globe through one gleaming, climate-controlled terminal and make the layover itself feel like a destination. For decades, that model was untouchable. Then came March 1st, 2026. A low-level security breach at Terminal 3. Not a catastrophic event by the standards of what the world has seen. 4 people injured. But the consequences? The consequences were seismic. 3,150 flights cancelled within a single 24-hour window. Think about that number for a moment. 3,000 flights. Not delayed, not rerouted. Cancelled. The flight map that had once looked like a dense web of global ambition, lines stretching from Dubai to every continent on Earth, suddenly went dark. And in the lounges of Terminal 3, something deeply unsettling began to take shape. The people waiting in those lines were not budget travelers on holiday packages. They were the golden visa holders, the expat executives, the architects, the consultants, the financial engineers who had been recruited from London and New York and Singapore to help run the Dubai machine. And they were not waiting to arrive. They were waiting to leave, willing to pay 5 times the standard fare, desperate for any seat on any plane to anywhere that felt more stable than where they were standing. When you see the elite running for the exit, you know the fire is not a drill. And outside in those famous parking lots, something that would have seemed absurd just months earlier was becoming entirely normal. Lamborghinis, Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, sitting in the desert heat with their keys still in the ignition. Not stolen, not broken down, simply abandoned. Because in the arithmetic of survival, $1 million engine is worth absolutely nothing if it cannot get you on a flight out. These were not the cars of people who had fallen on hard times. These were the cars of people for whom the calculation had simply changed overnight. Material wealth, the entire language Dubai had built its identity around, had become a burden rather than a trophy. That image, those gleaming supercars gathering sand and silence in the parking structure of an airport, is perhaps the most honest photograph Dubai has ever taken of itself. But the airport collapse, as dramatic as it was, is only the entry point. Because while the crowds were pressing against the check-in counters of Terminal 3, something else was unfolding in the sky above the coastline. And what was unfolding in that sky would strike at something even deeper than logistics. It would strike at the feeling that Dubai had always sold above everything else. Safety. February 28th, 2026. One day before the airport crisis officially began. That was the day the Burj Al Arab stopped being a symbol of invulnerability. A drone fell nearby. Fragments scattered. And for the first time in decades, the glass and steel of Dubai's most iconic silhouette reflected something other than sunrise over calm waters. It reflected the shock of a city that had genuinely never believed this moment could come. The Burj Al Arab was not just a hotel, it was a statement, an architectural argument that said, We have conquered the sea, conquered the desert, and now we have conquered your imagination. For a generation of travelers, catching sight of that sail-shaped tower from the air meant you had arrived somewhere exceptional, somewhere untouchable. That feeling, that specific emotional transaction, is now deeply, perhaps permanently, compromised. And Palm Jumeirah, the so-called eighth wonder of the modern world, an artificial island built purely from the force of will and an ocean of investment capital. People paid extraordinary sums to live there precisely because it felt removed, protected, exclusive. But when low-flying drones begin threading through the airspace above your luxury villa, exclusivity starts to feel less like a privilege and more like exposure. According to field reports from March, the Fairmont Resort on Palm Island suffered material damages running into tens of millions of dollars following interception explosions. The sky above the Palms, once reserved for New Year's fireworks that people flew in from around the world to witness, was now lit up by the streaks of a defense system doing its job. And the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building on Earth, the structure that Dubai pointed to whenever it wanted to say, "Look what we built," set a record in March 2026 that nobody wanted. The most emergency evacuations triggered by security alarms in a single week. Restaurants that once had waiting lists stretching months into the future were suddenly ready to seat you immediately. The observation deck, which had always hummed with the energy of tourists pressing their phones against the glass to capture the scale of it all, stood largely empty. 80,000 bookings at Dubai's landmark venues were cancelled in the first week alone. 80,000. And the ambitious projects still under construction, the ones that were supposed to be the next chapter in the Dubai story, began to feel less like progress and more like monuments to a confidence that had expired. The lights of the city, Dubai's most extravagant nightly performance, were dimmed under military protocols. The darkness that replaced them was not the darkness of a city sleeping. It was the darkness of a city that had finally run out of things to celebrate. Now let us talk about the economics, because the economics of what is happening here are as instructive as anything else. Dubai was not just a city that had hotels. It had built an entire financial philosophy around hotels. By the close of 2025, Dubai had more than 154,000 hotel rooms, sustained by an almost religious belief that occupancy rates would never meaningfully fall, that 80% would always be the floor, that the crowds would always come because the spectacle would always pull them. But here is the economic truth that gets overlooked when the champagne is flowing and the booking numbers are climbing. The costs in Dubai never sleep. The cooling systems alone, the technology required to make a desert city function as a luxury destination across the entire calendar year, cost billions of dollars annually regardless of how many guests are checking in. Dubai had constructed a fixed-cost behemoth, and the model only works when the variable revenue side of the equation holds firm. When it doesn't, the mathematics become brutal very quickly. In just the first weeks of the crisis, revenues collapsed by 20%. Hotels began offering discounts at a depth essentially unprecedented in the UAE's hospitality history. And still, the rooms sat empty. Because there is one thing that no discount can manufacture. There is one amenity that cannot be added to a package deal, no matter how creative the marketing team gets. And that is the simple, irreplaceable feeling of safety. No one is going to book a rooftop dinner overlooking a city where air raid alerts punctuate the evening. No reduction in the nightly rate changes that calculation. The ripple effects moved fast. The European food supply chains that fed Dubai's Michelin-starred restaurants began to contract. The luxury service ecosystem, every high-end spa, every designer boutique, every exclusive beach club that had relied on the uninterrupted flow of free-spending international visitors, entered what can only be described as clinical shock. Thousands of workers across that ecosystem found themselves holding resignation letters instead of paychecks. And then there is the real estate dimension, which may be the deepest wound of all. Property values in Dubai had surged 60% across the prior 3 years. 60%. Built on momentum, on confidence, on the expectation that the city's upward trajectory was simply the natural order of things. Moody's had already flagged that supply was set to increase by another 20% into that same compressed market. When the crisis hit and the cash flow dried up, the equation flipped overnight. Those million-dollar apartments in Palm Jumeirah were no longer assets performing in a rising market. They became illiquid, debt-heavy liabilities sitting in a city that had just issued its own travel advisory to the world. Dubai does not lack assets. What it suddenly and catastrophically lacked was cash flow. And an economy built entirely on attracting the spending of outsiders has no fallback when the outsiders stop coming. But as devastating as the economic collapse is to witness, there is a human story running alongside it that deserves equal attention. Because what happened in Dubai Marina in March was not just financial, it was existential. The boulevards that had been pristine, curated, maintained to a standard of presentation that was almost theatrical were beginning to show the first visible signs of neglect. Sand encroaching, litter gathering. The smart street lighting still dutifully switching on each evening, flooding empty sidewalks with light that had no one to illuminate. The ambient music systems still playing in the pedestrian areas, filling the air with a soundtrack designed for crowds that were no longer there. The effect was deeply unsettling, a city performing for an audience that had already left. And in the quiet corners of that city, the heartbreak was even more direct. Pets, dogs and cats left chained to lampposts, left behind in the wide-open apartments of Business Bay and the Marina, left in cages in the airport, no farewell given because there was no time, because the boarding call was the only thing that mattered, and everything else had to be sacrificed to it. In the panic of mass evacuation, people were reduced to impossible choices. And the animals they left behind, helpless and confused in a city that was itself in shock, became one of the most quietly devastating images of the entire crisis. When the most glamorous city in the world reveals itself as a place people are willing to abandon in hours with the doors left open and the belongings still on the floor, it tells you something profound about what the city always was underneath the surface. Not a home, a temporary assignment, an extended business trip dressed up in marble and gold. Now consider the population mathematics of all this. Dubai's resident population is 90% foreign nationals. 90%. On an investor presentation, that statistic looks like a monument to global appeal. In a crisis, it looks like a structural vulnerability of almost incomprehensible scale. There is no deep community of long-term residents with generational ties to the city, with nowhere else to go, with a reason to stay and weather the storm. There are employees, there are contractors, there are temporary residents on renewable visas, and when the crisis deepens, they do what any rational person in their position would do. They activate their exit plan. In the first quarter of 2026 alone, more than 40,000 highly skilled professionals quietly left. More than 127,000 visas had been cancelled as the early warning signs gathered. WhatsApp groups called Dubai Exit Plan began multiplying, filling with conversations between people who had been earning six-figure packages just months earlier, now sharing flight comparison websites and relocation checklists. International schools reported a 23% decline in enrollment. The healthcare system, one of the genuine points of pride in the Gulf, watched 28% of its nursing workforce disappear in a matter of weeks. And at the other end of the economic spectrum, a far quieter and far grimmer story was playing out. The migrant workers. The hundreds of thousands of men who had physically constructed every tower, every island, every road and stadium and mall in the Dubai story. Trapped under the kafala sponsorship system, earning $300 to $500 a month. No savings sufficient for a plane ticket. No legal pathway to simply leave. Projects stalling around them. Jobs evaporating. And no exit plan available because the exit plan requires money that was never given to them in the first place. Dubai had always spoken of itself as a meritocracy, a place where talent was rewarded and ambition was celebrated. But the full picture of who was asked to build the dream and who was permitted to leave it when it started burning says something uncomfortable about what that meritocracy was really built on. And into this vacuum, the competition has arrived with precision timing. Saudi Arabia is not waiting. With a declared target of 150 million tourists by 2030 and already reaching 122 million visitors by 2025, the kingdom is executing a strategic repositioning that makes Dubai's vulnerability feel less like bad luck and more like an exposed flank. Neom, the rise of Riyadh as a genuine cultural and commercial destination, the deliberate investment in experiences that feel rooted, that feel like they belong somewhere specific, rather than everywhere in general. These are not imitations of the Dubai model, they are a conscious rejection of it. Singapore, always watching, has become the stability choice. The flow of capital and professional talent that had been directed toward Dubai for years has not evaporated. It has simply changed its destination. And Western travel advisories, the practical instruments by which millions of middle-class travelers make their decisions, have reclassified Dubai from aspirational safe haven to risk zone in a remarkably short period of time. There is also a quieter shift happening in the global traveler's psychology that no security system can address. The new generation of people with money to spend, the ones Dubai has always needed to keep the machine running, are increasingly skeptical of what Dubai represents. The Guinness records, the world's tallest, largest, most expensive, the performance of wealth rather than the experience of culture, the copy-paste aesthetic of a city that built everything in 3 decades and consequently has the cultural depth of a brand new theme park. Authenticity has become the currency of serious travel, and authenticity is the one thing Dubai's architecture of superlatives was never designed to provide. So we arrive at the question that all of this is really asking. Can Dubai recover? And if it does, what does recovery actually mean? The technical answer is that cities rarely die. Infrastructure persists. Governments adapt. Al Maktoum International Airport is already being positioned to absorb the operational weight that Dubai International can no longer carry without question marks. Government rescue plans are in motion. The machinery of state intervention is working. But the more important question is not whether the airport reopens, or the hotel occupancy rates recover, or the real estate market stabilizes. The important question is whether Dubai is capable of accepting a truth it has spent its entire existence refusing to acknowledge: that a city built purely for display, engineered for the temporary visitor and the rotating expatriate, structured around infinite growth and the spectacle of material supremacy, is not a city in any meaningful sense. It is a product. And products require constant renewal, constant confidence, constant demand. The moment any one of those things falters, the entire proposition comes into question. What Dubai is confronting in 2026 is not just a tourism crisis. It is an identity crisis. And identity crises cannot be resolved with a new tower or a revised visa package or a cleverly worded marketing campaign. They require something much harder. They require honesty. Honesty about the cost of building a city on the labor of people who were never given the right to leave. Honesty about the risk of constructing an economy with no indigenous roots, no permanent community, no cultural bedrock to fall back on when the external conditions shift. Honesty about the limits of a model that always treated growth as both the means and the end, with no serious conversation about what sustainability actually looks like in a desert city in the middle of an increasingly unstable geopolitical region. The supercars are still in the parking lot. The pets are still waiting. The street music is still playing for empty boulevards. And the question hanging over all of it is not whether Dubai will survive. The question is what survives with it, and what the world learns from watching one of the most ambitious human constructions in history meet the moment it was never designed to face. What do you think? Is this the stumble before a genuine reinvention? Or is it the first honest reckoning with a model that was always more fragile than it looked? Leave your thoughts below. And if this kind of deep analysis into the forces reshaping our world resonates with you, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, because the story of Dubai in 2026 is far from over, and neither is ours. The glamour may be dimming, but the lessons it is leaving behind are some of the most valuable the modern world has produced. See you in the next one.